Um, all right. Hopefully we're all here to talk about some version of what's on the title. But I just want to get a general survey of the room because this is a very, very broad conference and I can't assume what people use. How many people here actually work on design systems day to day? Yeah, a few, like maybe 10% of the room. How many people use TypeScript? Whoa, holy crap, this is TypeScript Conf. How many people use GraphQL, some form of GraphQL in your work? Wow, about 30%, 40%. How many people use React? Also a decent amount in the room. Okay, so fortunately, this is a 20-minute talk, so I don't have time to introduce everything. Definitely feel free to, if you're not sort of up to speed on some of these technologies that I'm going to cover, definitely come to me afterwards, and I can point you to some resources, and you can contact me through various points of contact. And in fact, that's my first message to you: is relax. I'm recording this. I'm going to be posting up the slides, the sort of links that you can follow up on my site, as well as you can get in touch with me on Twitter and on email if you don't do Twitter. So I just want you to think about what the question, the core question that we're answering today, and not so much focus on the details because we don't have time to cover the details. This was originally like a 4-hour workshop, and so I'm going to start off with like what goes through your head when you hear about things like New York Times moving to React and GraphQL. What goes through your head when you hear that Shopify has open sourced their design system? And not just Shopify, but also IBM, Uber, the UK government, the US government, the GitHub, Audi, and Microsoft. Like just on and on and on. Like what is this trend that's going on? How does that fit into your mental framework of what is moving and shaking in the front-end engineering industry? What goes through your head when you hear that PayPal is moving to the Jamstack using Gatsby for PayPal.me and using GraphQL on the back end to coordinate all this
resources.
What goes through your head when you hear that Airbnb did a review and moved to TypeScript and said that 38% of their bugs could have been caught with TypeScript? If you can't read that, that's fine because you can pull it off of the Hacker News thread, and the Hacker News thread points to a Reddit thread which also discusses it. And the Reddit thread points to a picture that I took. It's just on my Twitter. So news travels very far. But I hope that there's some sort of mental framework that you're organizing all these bits and jabs of information. No single individual one of us can fully be on top of every single trend, and it's impossible. But I think if you have a mental framework to slot pieces of news items and like big moves, like these are not individual like pieces of hype. These are very carefully considered decisions that companies have made and they're investing millions of dollars in engineering resources into. So hopefully you have a question that sort of organizes all of that. My question to you is, what is driving front-end architecture decisions? Notice that this is a descriptive and not a prescriptive question. Like it's not what should you do. You're absolutely free to disagree with any individual one of these. My overall attempt here is just to try and organize the information. So my name is Sean. I go by Swix on the internets. I work at Netlify as a developer experience engineer. One of my key mottos is learning in public. And so that's where I come from. I'm a fellow learner among you. I haven't worked at Uber or IBM or Microsoft. I'm just like surveying the information and sharing what I've learned. And you're free to disagree, agree, and discuss it with me. I think we all grow and improve that way. And one of my other sort of part-time responsibilities is I help to moderate the r/React.js subreddit. There's 140,000 of us sort of discussing React, talking about React, and definitely if you do React in your day job, it's a great place to share what you're working on and discover new things that you could use. But as part of my job, I kind of review a lot of news flow coming in, and I see things that come up again and again and again, and trends that companies are all converging on. And that's what we're here to discuss today. So the New York Times, I'm just kind of pulling quotes from them. This is like it's really hard to like pull a quote because you lose context. For them, React has allowed them to collaborate faster with less duplications and more reusable components. Notice that now most frameworks have a concept of components, so it's not unique to React at all. for GraphQL as well, they feel that it makes Relay on Apollo makes it easy for them to take in all that data and make it easy to consume for React components. So it's kind of like componentizing data as well as UI. For CodePen, one thing I really enjoy is the CodePen Radio, because they actually have the employees and founders of CodePen talking through the tech stack decisions. So you can really sort of join them in their journey of evaluating and then seeing the results of their tech choices. For Apollo and GraphQL, which they recently adopted, it empowers the front end to do what the front end does best, which I think is what a lot of us here are interested in. Like less and less and less of the boring, mundane stuff, and more of the interesting business logic and things that will actually move the needle for our users. Airbnb, we already talked about the TypeScript thing, but they also have made very extraordinary claims about their GraphQL usage. I think it's maybe a hyperbole to talk about 10x improvements, but definitely check out their GraphQL Summit video, where they actually do some live coding about how to flow types from the back end to the front end and validate changes on both sides. And that's by Adam Neary. So the question, like, as you go through all of these news pieces, I actually had more. I couldn't leave in. What are people using? So one tool that comes to mind is Storybook. This is a tool to actually visualize different states of your components, to mess with it via knobs, to change the view to see how you would interact with it in a live setting. And this is very in line with the whole idea of reusable components. Like if you want to have reusable components, have a dedicated environment to test it, document it, right, and actually just it's all about documentation. Again, Storybook. If I were to pin this entire thesis on just one thing, that wouldn't be very fair. There's actually a whole bunch of other ecosystem of tools like Docs, which I help to maintain, Docusaurus from Facebook, as well as React Style Guide, and a bunch more. This one on the right is Pattern Lab from Brad Frost, who also invented atomic design, which is kind of the like pre-idea of like components. Like you compose everything from atoms to molecules to organisms to templates and pages. So what we're really driving at here is some overarching idea that you can use these tools for, and people have found really, really useful in composing their design systems. TypeScript. What's the value proposition of TypeScript? Well, JavaScript doesn't have that many good parts, so we need to have some static checking to help us catch at write time, at compile time, when we're passing in different parts and breaking the implicit contracts that we set up to our functions. So that's also very helpful. But again, they're not the only option available. There's Flow, Reason, Elm, PureScript, and I'm sure you can name a bunch more in this category. What about GraphQL and Apollo? GraphQL is a great way. Again, I feel like half the room has already been sold on this, but for the other half, GraphQL is a great way to really sort of manage, just request the data that exactly the data that you want, and there's a lot other that I'm skimming over, but it's a really opinionated bunch of tooling that is working very well for many teams. Apollo in particular has done a lot more integrations on the client and server side to make this experience worth it. So, but again, they're not the only tools playing in this space. There's Relay, FetchQL, Urkel, and on the GraphQL side, GraphQL is just a spec. It's a protocol, and there are other protocols that compete with it, Protobuf, OData. And in fact, yesterday when I was putting together some of these slides, there was a new one just launched, Vulkan. The whole trend is towards smarter APIs. Like the classical implementation of REST hasn't been very well enforced, or could be better. Like in the sense that we have so many different clients with different needs, and we evolve at different rates between the product and the platform. We want something that is smarter, that evolves with our needs, that is more than just standard REST. So there's something there. That's on the front end, the consumption of GraphQL. On the production of GraphQL, you also have a whole bunch of ecosystems. Prisma is one of them. They produce this Prisma Playground with auto-documenting fields that you can sort of explore and navigate your schema on the back end. So that's a very interesting way to explore GraphQL. I think the other thing that is very exciting in backend GraphQL is sort of GraphQL native databases. So you have players like AWS AppSync, Hasura, and PostGraphQL providing this. Obviously, your backend logic is not just databases, so you also want some layer of arbitrary logic. So you have Google, AWS, and then second layer clouds like Netlify, where I work, and Zeit. And then also you want to bring in a whole bunch of third-party APIs, and where you want to sort of munge them together into one sort of backend for front end is probably in an arbitrary serverless function layer. So these are all trends that are like kind of going on, and I think that it's really interesting to sort of think about like how do you tie them into your front end. So React is obviously fairly dominant in terms of front end frameworks, but they're by far not the only ones. We have a whole bunch of other competing and equally useful front end frameworks. But also, even within React, we have schisms about how to approach SEO, how to approach performance. And I think these are all things that like companies are exploring and investing in and adopting. And I think it's worthwhile being on top of basically each of these four regions that I've sketched out. And so that's the whole story of like what people are using. It's already too many logos, right? And if you want more logos, I got more for you. And this is like, on one hand, you can call this fatigue, right? You're like, oh God, like there's no humanly possible way I can remember all these names, much less what they do. On the other hand, it's a huge field. Like we're working in one of the biggest fields in programming in programming history, and it's great that we have this much choice and innovation. So I want to propose a way to organize all of this. So let's take this away and take a look at like abstract, stepping away from the tool. What's the actual thing we're trying to do? We're trying to accomplish design systems. So let's step away from TypeScript. What are we trying to achieve for applications? We're actually trying to achieve static typing for applications. Step away from Apollo, GraphQL, and all that. What we're trying to do is we're trying to achieve smarter APIs that work for us instead of being sort of constrained to a dumb API, for the lack of a better word. And step away from front-end frameworks, what we're trying to do is solve this hard problem of server or client-side rendering. And we'll talk a little bit about these in turn. But again, I only have 20 minutes. So let's talk. And so when I put them together, that's what I come to for Star Apps. Like it's a nice acronym. It's actually what I call a backronym. Like I started with like, all right, what spells out STAR, and sort of worked back to like what are the key trends that I really want to talk about and focus on. But these things are these things are themes that come up in your daily news flow, and even at this conference, you'll see a whole bunch of different perspectives on this. And I think that's really interesting to have an overall organizing framework to organize them. So having discussed the what, you can also talk about the why people are moving, like why bother? Like if nothing's broken, don't fix it, right? So so I think the primary thesis that I'm working with right now is that they want more consistency and they want better ways to deal with data in two particular ways. So they want visual consistency between all of their apps and user interfaces. They want code consistency between each of the different modules and files that they're writing, and they want tools to help them check that and enforce that, right? Data manipulation, it's this one is more about like back end and front end sort of interfacing between them and getting that requesting the data in an efficient way and fast way. Representation on the front end, that's actually the one with the most debate right now. I don't even know if like representation is the right word that I'm looking for. But essentially, there are a whole bunch of performance issues to do with the era of single-page apps and client-side rendering that we're still working through as an industry. So as I sort of lay these out, like these seem to be the four sort of rough fields that we're sort of debating on and moving towards and investing in droves. Like these are dozens and dozens of companies that I've sort of overviewed. There are dangers to adopting these. First of all, is increasing the learning curve. What does it take to become a React developer in 2019? There's someone who keeps a GitHub repo, and this is his map. And at the bottom it says "keep learning" with a passive-aggressive smiley face. And that's a real problem for people joining our industry. And as we add on more tooling, we have to be mindful of the costs versus the benefit of adding all these toolings. Like, are they pulling their weight in terms of their tools? Tool churn, like having bet on a particular tool. How sure are you that any one of these are going to stick around or be the dominant player to invest in? These are all concerns when adopting a new tool. But you do want to solve the problems that they solve. So at some point you got to make a bet and accept the fact that you may be wrong. But as long as something is open source, you can probably run it, maintain it, so on and so forth. which also comes with its own issues, right? Most of open source maintenance is unpaid. Um, and actually, I think that something that's a little bit less discussed is that as open source gets more and more serious, it's not so much that most open source has no funding. It's probably that open source has direct funding from one party. So each of these tools that I mentioned in my talk actually are actually run by in a particular company, and the governance is not as clear as a traditional open source tool, and that's something that you have to wrestle with as well and be comfortable with. Open licensing is very important and helps to ensure that there is some base level of ownership of your tools if you should ever need to take ownership of them. And upfront work. All of these things aren't necessary to get an app up and running. They're not necessary to get something showing up on your browser. But you still want to invest in them, which front loads all the work of documentation, communication, adding types so that you can catch yourself in later on. So absolutely, these are not things that you use for MVPs. But you may want to use them as your team grows and you start to lose context and communication between people and yourself as you sort of work on things over time. So there are dangers to that. But I think for me, I think the draw is all about the workflow. Again, I don't have time. Like I have another 20 more minutes of stuff to work through here. But I think that all of these things are really interesting to explore. How sort of Apollo and GraphQL sort of generates types and flows it down to the front end, so you have stronger types from the end to end. For designer developer workflow, you have design system tools like Sketch and Framer generating React components that you can use directly, right? So you have your single source of truth is your design tool. Documentation, TypeScript and Storybook, help you document things up front. Performance, GraphQL, Apollo. Help you sort of request, reduce the amount of data you're requesting over the wire, and React helps you render things either on the server side or statically. And most of all, I think the final category is something I'm most interested in, is that you're optimizing for change, in that any particular decision that you make, you might need to move on and restructure and reformat later on. How much of a heavy lift is it for you to restructure? So all of these things are design goals in terms of what people want to adopt. Like they want their tooling to assist them in planning for things that they don't know is coming down the pike. And so that's a very, very high bar, and that's a very high design goal. But I think that all these things help the workflow in terms of the star systems, star apps. Chris Coyer, actually, I don't know if he's here, but he's actually going to give a talk tomorrow, which I resisted for a long time, but I had to include this stack. There's also a concept of basically like the more and more the back end is commoditized, the less we worry about the back end, the more we sort of focus on engineering efforts on the front end. So we used to worry about the LAMP stack, and now as the operating system cloud layer gets firmed up, then we moved on to the mean stack, and now we're all the way up to the front end, where we actually worry about the products and not so much about the platform stuff. And that's where we're at in terms of the evolution of stacks. And I think you'll hear more about this in Chris's talk tomorrow. So my answer to what is driving front-end architecture decisions is really just star apps. I think if you understand that these trends are things that people want, and there are sort of recommended solutions for each of these trends, you have a framework for evaluating each of your tech choices, and why you might want to adopt them in your own team. So yeah, that's my overall summary and talk. I have this recorded, and you can find it on my own site. And thank you for having me. I'll stick around.